Hi, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Victoria Taylor and I'm the director of the Iraq Initiative. And today we're here to talk about the end of the US-led Operation Inherent Resolve mission. Now, the US military presence in Iraq has been a defining element of US engagement in Iraq over the past 2 decades. In September 2024, the Biden administration and the Iraqi government announced that Operation Inherent Resolve would end its Iraq mission in September 2025. The announcement was big news in Iraq, but really, I think, just skated by, maybe unnoticed in the United States. And perhaps that's because the press release was actually issued within an hour of the news that Hassan Nasrallah died after an Israeli strike. And in the intervening year, of course, there have been even more momentous developments in the Middle East, including but not limited to the fall of Assad and US and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear program. And it's easy to see how Iraq can really get buried in those headlines. During today's discussion, we're going to put the focus back on Iraq. We'll discuss what we know about the upcoming military transition, the impact on US and Iraqi security interests, and what this transition means for the future of the US-Iraq partnership. I'd like to thank Crescent Petroleum, DT Institute, and Onyx Holding for their sponsorship of the Iraq Initiative and for making today's discussion possible. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Vivian Salama, staff writer at The Atlantic. Vivian has been covering foreign policy and national security for over 2 decades across a number of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, NBC, and CNN. And she's also reported across the Middle East, including serving as the Baghdad bureau chief for the Associated Press. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Vivian.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me back here. Always a pleasure to be here, and especially talking about a country that is so dear to my heart. I want to introduce the rest of our panel, although none of them need an introduction, in no particular order. Ambassador James Jeffrey. The ambassador has had a number of government assignments that it's almost too hard to list them all, but among them, Deputy National Security Advisor, Ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania, and he also served as Chief of Mission Syria and Special Representative to defeat ISIS coalition. Congressman Darren LaHood also serves on too many committees and caucuses to name, but for our specific interests, he is a member of the House Intelligence Committee and hails from the 18th District of Illinois. He also takes part in a number of different Middle Eastern initiatives and caucuses, Lebanon among them. Victoria Taylor, I'm going to introduce you anyway. Even though everyone knows you here, director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. She had 2 decades of experience in the Middle East and Europe, including a career as a career foreign service officer with the rank of Minister Counsel. She most recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran at the State Department's Bureau of Near East Affairs. And finally, but not least of which, Dr. Rinad Mansour, who is a senior research fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program and director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. He also has a number of impressive affiliations, including the American University of Iraq, Sulaymaniyah, Cambridge University, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. So I'm so glad to have you all with us. Victoria, I'm going to start with you only because you sort of flicked at this in your opening remarks and kind of going back to our preparation for this panel where you said, we're going to try to figure out what comes next. And I think, to sum it up, I might have sent you like one of those shrug emojis because there is a little bit of mystery right now as far as what really is going to come next regarding our presence in Iraq. So why don't you flesh out for us what we do know and what we don't know?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, of course, the Biden administration announced in September 2024 that the Operation Inherent Resolve mission in Iraq would end by September 2025, with an agreement that operations out of Iraq into Syria could continue through September 2026. And if you look at the text of that announcement, it's actually quite vague. And really, I think that was done very purposefully to allow some flexibility and continue discussions between the 2 governments about what the exact details of the future US troop presence, where they would be based, and how that would continue. What we don't know still, and what has not been announced by either the Iraqi government or the US government, is exactly what the numbers could continue to look like. Will there still be a US troop presence in federal Iraq beyond the end of this month? Where the US could continue to be based if it does stay in some capacity in a bilateral fashion. And also, whether there's going to be really a continued scope of future security cooperation. What kinds of things and missions might the US and Iraq continue to work on even after the end of Operation Inherent Resolve? And despite my very best efforts in contacting many, many people inside of the administration, outside of the administration, in the Iraqi government, I think those details are still not totally clear.
Okay. Congressman, you were just in Iraq, and I'd be curious to hear what you're hearing from our partners. Do they know what's going on? And also, what's the temperature like as far as, or the opinion right now with regard to U.S. presence? Do they want us to stay? Do they want us to go?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for having me on this panel and for the opportunity to talk about Iraq here today. As you referenced, I serve on the House Intelligence Committee. I just did a trip to Iraq in the region and was on the ground in Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, and Baghdad. And I would just mention, make a couple observations. Obviously, what happens with the election is top of mind in November with the Prime Minister and whether he retains his position. So that was a focus. There's a lot of concern, obviously, what's going on next door in Syria, what the U.S. role is there, what is going to transpire there, how there's obviously a lot of fear about the reconstitution of ISIS and what that means. So from a national security standpoint, from an IC standpoint, a lot of conversation about that. I would also just say a lot of focus on the Shia militia groups and their impact on the current government in Iraq, and tried to get a feel on how palpable that is and what that means for the United States. Obviously, I don't speak for the Trump administration, but I think there's a lot of concern about the Shia militia groups, particularly the top 6 there, what they're engaged in, what they're doing, their collaboration and cooperation with Iran, and that was a topic of conversation also.
Since the congressman mentioned Syria, Ambassador, I'd love for you to chime in. I mean, you were literally in the room where it happens for so many years with regard to the conversations about how to de-escalate and defeat ISIS. And now there really is a concern, given everything that's happening in Syria, of a resurgence, and certainly if we withdraw. So what are you seeing, and particularly bringing Syria into the context, where do you feel that we are in this fight?
Yeah, and first of all, I also want to thank the Atlantic Council, particularly my former desk officer, Victoria, for inviting me. And I'm going to answer the question kind of roundabout. First of all—
Once in government, always in government.
Yeah,
okay.
One, we have troops in countries typically for 2 reasons. One is some huge emergency, Korea 1950, Kuwait 1990, Iraq 2014, where there's some dramatic, typically invasion that impacts our own security or those of our partners around. So it's not just of the country that we're going in and trying to defend, it's a broader thing. That's not the case in Iraq now. Secondly, we have troops because of various relationships we have with that country. A military and a broader security relationship has to be based upon the nature of the relationship. We can get into that. Congressman alluded to some of the difficulties, but there are also many pluses in the American-Iraq relationship too, which Victoria was responsible for in the State Department up until recently. But getting to the question of Syria, I'm going to say something heretical, and that is, it is very hard to end any military mission the United States has ever done. We finally left Berlin. We're still in the Sinai. We went back to Korea in 1950. We're still there. Now, there are reasons for all of that, but there's also a certain inertia. There's a comfort feeling of having U.S. troops both in the country they're in, among at least some, and in America. But in particular with the Trump administration, I can speak more of the first than the second, but I think the second, if anything, will be more aggressive. There is a second look at every single troop commitment we have and whether this is serving American interests. And the problem with we have to keep not just a security relationship with Iraq, but a troop presence, and there's a difference that we can get into later, because of ISIS in Syria is, for me, problematic. Because, again, it's very difficult to ever end a mission because the residual American presence, I should say, because I don't want to mix mission definitions, an American military presence, because the mission they were sent there for is never completely done. Trump was, the only reason we kept troops on in Syria was because we in the State Department, not DOD, DOD kept on saying, we're fighting ISIS under the authorization for the use of military force, what is that, Victoria, October 2001? And Trump kept saying, wait, I made an announcement after Rockefeller that, we've defeated ISIS.
Defeated
and the
ISIS, right.
residuals, why are you people telling me that? We went back and said, hey, boss, there are other reasons we're in Syria. Iran, and of course we threw in the oil fields, people threw in the oil fields, and away we went, and the troops are still there. But the point I'm trying to make is that, and of course, of all days, we're here on September 11th, it's particularly hard for anybody, even an ex-official, to get up in public on any terrorist threat and say, that threat is over or it's no longer a big threat, but I'll try to do it. I don't think ISIS is a major threat. It particularly isn't a major threat in Iraq. It needs to be watched in Syria, particularly in the Arab areas, Dar ez-Zor and Raqqa, that are uneasily controlled by the Kurds, and there was tension when I was there, and I'm sure the tension is greater. ISIS exploits it. They're in the Badia Desert. Syria is, under different circumstances, still a chaotic place, and that's a breeding ground for ISIS, so it needs to be watched. But I don't think it is an emergency situation that requires combat troops. And this is something we can get into, the nature of the residual U.S. mission in Iraq under Title 50, a combat force or a force under CENTCOM specifically, with the restrictions on its mission by the Iraqis, with the taskings it's received, does not look all that different than a Title 22 security assistance relationship with a significant number of military people under the ambassador. Now,
Can you just flesh out what that means for folks who don't know?
Sure, okay. All right. You, as part of security assistance legislation and foreign assistance legislation, besides a defense attaché office, embassies have reporting to the ambassador, although indirectly to the regional combatant commander, offices. They used to be called MAGs. Back, none of you were probably alive, and MAGs got a bad reputation because it was the Vietnam MAG we had, and we're about 20,000 strong up until Westmoreland got there. But then they have names like Office of Security Cooperation, Office of Defense Cooperation, but they're the same model. It is a military organization designed to do defense coordination, training, equipping. It has the FMS portfolio, and various other boutique country-by-country missions to strengthen and advance the security side of the relationship. But again, it is formally part of the embassy. The people get one or another form of diplomatic status. They're not under a status of forces agreement. So the legal basis is different. The command and control on paper is different, although believe me, I had a lieutenant general heading mine, and I wouldn't dream of giving him an order without checking first with the CENTCOM commander, as would he. So in practice, they're not all that different. But we can get into that later, because I think that's the way we're going to head.
You definitely raised about 3 more points that I want to circle back to. But Dr. Mansour, I want to ask you about your work on the Iraqi security forces and the popular mobilization forces, which takes me back because I've spent a lot of time with both groups. What are you hearing from them as far as their appetite for continued assistance? Do they feel that they're ready to go it alone? Do they feel like the U.S. isn't maybe the ideal partner that it was a decade ago? Where do we stand at this point?
So I think the big story since October 7th, but also the June war, is a story of success for Iraq, in that it has somehow managed to stay insulated, where so many countries in the region were kind of engulfed in the wars and the conflicts. And so we ask why that is. Everyone would have expected Iraq. It has an axis of resistance connection. It has connections to Iran, to Lebanon, to Syria, easily to have fallen into this regional war, but it hasn't. And I think there's some important answers there. First of all, coming into how the security forces and some of the senior popular mobilization forces see their role. At a time when the region is changing, at a time when Iran is weakening, it's about local, it's about sort of the state of Iraq and wanting to work within that construct. As one of the PMF leaders told me, this isn't the time for resistance. There's other things going on in Iraq that we want to focus on. To answer your question then, what are some of their anxieties still? First of all, even those who were calling for an end to the US have kind of taken a step back right now to say, maybe we need to reconsider such a hardline position. Their paranoias are partly concern about what could happen, whether that insulation from conflict could fall apart, particularly with Syria and although the numbers of ISIS attacks are as low as it's ever been, there is that paranoia, as well as with Iran. And yes, Iran also did not ask the PMF to fight in June. If the regime in Tehran at any point feels more of an existential threat, this is a theater still, so there's that concern as well. There's also technical concerns that they relayed, intelligence, ISR, and in those conversations, they very much don't want to be a, Team Iran only, or Team China only, or Team Russia only. They very much have this idea of multi-alignment. So these binaries, West versus East or US versus Iran, they're trying to push against that. And this, I mean, many of the seniors.
Which kind of reinforces what Ambassador Jeffrey said about, making a case for a non-combat role and maybe other issues.
Oh yeah, and when we get to the kind of sticky, sort of more delicate questions, it becomes clear that I've never had so many people in the security sector talk about investments and US investments and economics. I mean, very clearly, Iraqis, just like many others in the world, have realized the US administration is business-minded, and so what are the investment opportunities? And that's been a big message as well. So I guess to conclude then, the paranoias are real. The Iraqi security sector, even though there's been billions spent on it, even though there's been all this capacity building, is not a strategic, coherent security force. It cannot respond coherently to any potential threat. There are too many chains of command. There are too many generals, each with their own party bosses. At some point, if a threat does come up, it won't be able to respond. And I think that is the basis of why many are concerned, even though right now the story of Iraq is one of relative success.
Is some of that, I'm just curious, is some of that the product of Soleimani being killed, that they've kind of got disorganized?
So not just Soleimani, but
the ICRC general, of course, so you all know him, Quds Force general.
I think he's very famous to people.
I think everyone knows him, yes. As a journalist, we explain things, we over-explain.
But also Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the de facto leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces. They both were tackling a major problem, which was the fight against ISIS brought together many different armed groups, Shia, but others, Sunnis, Yazidis, just to fight against ISIS. And once that fight ended, you had all of these groups And they were trying to institutionalize it. They were trying to figure out, how do we develop more of a coherent, we can't have this tiny militia in one part of Iraq shoot rockets and then we have to answer to it. So this is a problem. Unlike the other groups in other countries, the PMF is far too incoherent. There are far too many leaders, there's far too many loyalties, and because of that, I think it became even worse once both Abu Mahdi and Qasem Soleimani was killed in terms of fragmentation.
Fascinating. So Victoria, and first a programming note, now that we've gotten cooking, we will open the floor to questions, so definitely think some great questions up for our distinguished panel here. But I want to put a question to all of you, and all of you feel free to jump in. You know, Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned Iran, and that's something that really stood out for me, having covered the first Trump White House and now the second, is that Iran seemed to be at the center of their entire Middle East policy in 1.0. This time around, are you seeing some changes just in terms of, obviously, the landscape is so different this time around with all the regional events? And does that bode well for Iraq, that it could actually have its own coherent policy in Trump 2.0 versus, you know, just this kind of sweeping policy that centers around Iran? Maybe we'll start with you, Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, you know, I alluded to this earlier. I think Iraq is kind of off the front pages, and it's, you know, not at the top of mind of senior policymakers right now. And I think you can see that in the fact that, you know, we don't have a U.S. ambassador, as we don't in many countries throughout the world right now. But we also have a Middle East policy which is being run and really divided up between a number of very close friends to the president. We have Steve Witkoff, you know, Mossad Boulos, Tom Barrack, have really kind of carved up spheres of influence between the different countries in the Middle East, but none of them have Iraq. So who's the senior person in this administration who's responsible for Iraq right now? And I would say because of that, I wouldn't say that we really have a clearly defined affirmative Iraq policy. We have an Iraq policy which is kind of a corollary to our Iran policy. And I would say this is where the conversation about the security partnership and the overall relationship becomes much more important, because I don't think that even if you're trying to counter Iran, you can do so effectively in Iraq without having a policy that's actually targeted towards Iraq. And we can't counter Iran just on the security front. We do have to focus on economic ties, energy ties. And so, you know, this moment in the partnership, I think, is an opportunity to figure out and kind of rescope the relationship so that we're not just anchored by, you know, a significant U.S. troop presence, which, you know, has been alluded to, is a source of domestic political tension. It's an opportunity to reduce that tension, maybe normalize the security partnership in a way that we're more partners than occupiers, and then really figure out other areas that we can work on jointly.
I mean, Ambassador, I saw you nodding your head too. Did you want to?
I was nodding my head, but then I was making a face when she said occupiers. I don't want to feed that view. No, I think you're right, and I think that on Iran, I don't want to predict this administration. Even when I was in the last Trump administration, I learned not to predict what would happen the next day. But I would say what we can live with as opposed to what we will demand will be that Iraq does not seem to be going down the road that Lebanon has gone down, and despite some hopes with this agreement and such in the last few months, in the last weeks, may still be going down that road. So that means two things. First of all, why do we have a problem with Lebanon? The pro-Iranian forces in Lebanon, Hezbollah, developed their own transnational power projection capabilities against both Israel and very significantly in Syria, and through training and other things throughout the region, including with the Houthis. That is definitely what we don't want to see happen with the Hashishabi. Two, the pro-Iranian political element, which was a combination of Hezbollah and Amal, encompassing essentially the entire Shia population, eventually came to dominate Lebanon, not just in its foreign policy choices, which were typically tilting towards Iran, but in many other things that led to the collapse of the country financially and economically in the last decade. We don't want to see that happen to a country so much more important. Sorry, Lebanon, but I mean, Iraq has tremendous oil and gas reserves. It's a much larger country strategically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that if they don't go down that road, and I think there's good chances they won't, in part because there are many Shia who are not particularly pro-Iranian, and you have powerful other forces, the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds in the north, who don't want to see the country go down that road. So I think that there's a real chance that you can keep it from going down that road. But if I had to describe what we don't want to see, and we'll get a reaction, it will be that.
Right, Congressman?
You were asked a question about whether Iran is weaker this time around than the first Trump administration. I think clearly they're at the weakest point they've been in a long time, at least in the last 20 to 25 years. And if you look at the Shia proxies that dominated much of the Middle East, the Houthis in Yemen, their support for Hamas in Gaza, Nasrallah in southern Lebanon and through Hezbollah, obviously Assad in Syria, and the Shia proxies in Iraq. They've all been significantly weakened, and that doesn't even take into account what happened in the 12-day war and what happened to their nuclear facilities there. So that is fundamentally changed the dynamics of this Trump administration compared to the last.
Sure.
And I don't think you can underestimate how weak they are and how transformational that could be in Lebanon. I have more optimism than the ambassador when it comes to Lebanon than he probably does, but I think we've set the stage now with Hezbollah being weak as they've ever been to rebuild Lebanon there, and the changes in Syria. Lots to go there. We have a lot longer to go, a longer way to go in Syria, but it sets the stage for us to play a significant role there.
Let me follow up, because here in Washington, certainly, covering politics and foreign policy, you hear President Trump repeatedly say that he wants to end the wars. Forget about the fact that we just renamed the DOD, the Department of War. That's another story. But it seems to be an objective that he is struggling with so far. What's the view on the Hill in terms of continuing assistance for Iraq? And I'm sure that our partners are coming to you all saying, what does this mean for us? And just generally the party's mood in terms of this kind of shifting sentiment toward isolationism. What do you make of all of that?
Well, I think the Prime Minister in Iraq, Soudani, has done a good job in outreach to the United States. I think him making a couple trips here, his outreach, his communication, I know with Secretary Rubio and others, I think has been constructive. I think their actions have been helpful. But I think we're going to reach a few inflection points here on how they handle the Shia militias within Iraq through the legislative mechanism. And of course, that depends on the election and what happens. But I think the administration is looking at Iraq through the lens of the Shia proxies and what happens with them. And if there is truly outreach to the United States and to the West, which there's been positiveness in that direction, I think they're at a kind of fork in the road in terms of what direction they go on that. And much of that will be dictated by the election, but also how they rein in the Shia proxies and how that's viewed by this administration through the NSC and through the State Department.
Do you think there are opportunities, Dr. Mansour, for partnership with any kind of partnership with our allies, the forces that we are allied with in Iraq, to basically, gain supremacy and be reliable security partners moving forward?
Definitely. In fact, in the last few years, NATO has expanded and increased its presence in Iraq, both in the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior. The Iraqi government has made it very clear in the security sector and in other sectors that it wants to continue to have a relationship with the United States. And as I say, this is not just in the Ministry of Defense and Interior, but also parts of the sort of the Shia groups, the political groups, and the PMF have understood Iraq turning into a pariah state where the US consider it to be a wing of Iran, and therefore sanctions and closing it off is not in the interest of Iraq's leadership. And beyond that, the interest of Iraq's leadership is to have relations with the Gulf, with US allies in the region, as well as with the US.
Does the Gulf have the mutual interest?
Yes, I mean, most Gulf countries. I think, Kuwait and Iraq relations need to be, I think, focused on and worked on. But certainly, you've seen in the last decade or so a remarkable improvement of relations, particularly between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iraq. And I think that's a very positive trajectory. That type of connection and relationship could push Iraq even further away from breaking free from Iran's grip. So if the concern of Washington is that Iraq is too close to Iran, sanctioning alone is not going to fix that problem. Supporting these types of economic and other policies in the region, creating a security architecture in the region that includes Iraq as a partner, is the solution.
I would just say the other thing that I think needs to be worked on in Iraq is the economy. They are so heavily reliant on the energy sector. They have not appropriately diversified. They haven't had those partners come in like they want. Now, the outreach has been there, but there needs to be more collaboration and cooperation.
Does anyone want to do that with the security situation in the region?
I think they've signed a lot of these MOUs, but nothing's been pen to paper, codified into, and I think they're waiting on the election to see what direction this goes.
I mean, I'm kind of curious if American companies would be on board or Western companies would be on board, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing signs that Western and U.S. Companies are interested in doing business, particularly in the oil and gas. And so we've had some big deals signed over the past couple of years. Total signed a deal about $27 billion. BP signed a deal $25 billion. Chevron, again, it's kind of an interim agreement right now, but I think that's a sign that U.S. companies, Western companies, see some great potential for doing business in Iraq. I think it's also a sign that this Iraqi government is really trying to reach out to Western companies and trying to facilitate those deals. And I think we should interpret those signs very positively as trying to signal that this is an Iraqi government and an Iraq that sees value in not only security partnership, but economic partnership with Western companies. And I hope that that's something that we're able to seize.
Interesting. Something I wanted to ask before we kind of went onto the business element is maybe for Dr. Mansour, but all of you, obviously, I'm old enough to remember this concept of the Shia crescent that was talked about so much 20 years ago. And I'm curious where that stands, given the fact that, Iran's capabilities have been targeted so many times, given what's happened in Lebanon and in Syria. Is there something like that now? I mean, where does that kind of pan-Middle Eastern Shia alliance stand right now, and how does that impact Iraq and Syria, for that matter?
I'll start. It's for the moment dead, but the idea and the desire is still there. That's very important. From my own experience, the Iranians are reaching out, trying to figure out how to get back into Syria. I think that's going to be a hard sell. The Russians are going to be more lucky, but I don't think the Iranians will, unless things go really downhill with the Israelis. I don't think that'll happen, but we'll see. But they certainly want to hold on to what's left of their power base in both Lebanon and in Iraq. Now, I was just as optimistic as the congressman a month ago on Lebanon, but the latest developments where we didn't get a disarmament by the end of the year, and rather it's now this vague thing, and the Amal and Hezbollah forces seem happy. Whenever they're happy, that's bad for the future of Lebanon. And Iraq was, from the Iranian standpoint, always to some degree the weak link in the Shia crescent, because we were there, the Kurds were there, the Turks are there in the north, and there's a lot of people, beginning with the whole apparatus in Najaf, that are Shia who aren't particularly pro-Iranian. But still, we have to watch that. I think that there'll be a push. I honestly believe that certainly the government, most Iraqis, and to some degree the Hashishabi, to the extent they can have independence of view, want to have a pluralistic relationship. I wouldn't say a pro-American, but they're okay with the Americans, particularly American firms, being there. They're okay, as we've just discussed, with our relations with the other Gulf Arab states. But there's a problem here, and again, I refer to Lebanon. The power projection of Hezbollah was an inherent part of the Shia crescent. The takeover of most institutions and then the destruction of them in Lebanon was not. That's a function of any ideological absolutist group that I have seen all over the world for 50 years. They tend to not want pluralism. They tend to shut it down. They don't want to do things formally and officially. They want to do things through corruption behind the scenes, including up to assassinations when people get in their way. And that's their modus operandi. And in the end, that is not compatible with a normally functioning state. A normally functioning state is what is required for things like Total and Chevron to really carry out these things. That's the security problem, not this vague idea that ISIS is going to come sweeping back across the board.
Absolutely, yeah. And please, yes.
Just to answer, I think it's also important to note that Iraqis are Iraqis. And for over a decade, if not longer, there have been protests where Shia Iraqis, which many people thought would just be part of this crescent across the region, have been protesting about Iran out. You know, Iran, we want Iran out. So Iran has lost a lot of ideational power in this base in the south that it just assumed, took for granted at some point in the early days. And I think this is why the Gulf, for example, has seen that you can have a Shia prime minister who isn't Iranian, right? And that has one of the reasons why you have improved relations. So ideationally, the Shia crescent has, splintered, and the same is true in Lebanon. There have been lots of protests against Iran and Hezbollah, even by Shia Lebanese and others. So there's that, and at the same time, there's also a sense of pragmatism by even those Shia leaders who are just assumed to be part of Iran's crescent. And this is where I push back on the word proxy. Because to assume proxy would mean that this person is there to simply act as told. Iran gives a green light, you go. Iran gives a red light, you don't. And and there may be some who do that, but many of the more powerful groups in the Iraqi state, the PMF, are not mere proxies. They have their own local interest, and sometimes they listen to Iran, and sometimes they don't listen to Iran. So this is a fundamental challenge. Now, at the same time, we talked about Lebanon being strategically less valuable to the US than Iraq. It's certainly the case for Iran as well. Iran is rethinking its defense doctrine. This whole idea of forward defense is falling apart. Whatever Iran's next defense doctrine will be, Iraq will be the cornerstone of it. Because unlike Lebanon, it's on the border, it's an important buffer. Economically, it's vital for Iran as well. So there are many reasons why the stability of Iraq and the coherence of Iraq becomes very important for Iran, because the war isn't over. The conflict in the Middle East isn't over. Once the dust settles, the Middle East will look different, but we are currently still in the mess.
What about other partners? I mean, when I was there a decade ago, I used to hear Russian spoken in every hotel in Basra. What about, the Russians have other problems these days, but what about the Chinese? Are there other partners trying to step in and fill the void?
Certainly, particularly, the Chinese economically, but certainly China has become a vital lifeline to Iran and Iraq in terms of exports of oil and gas and other products. Russia is there, but there is a pragmatism. So if you speak to an Iraqi general and you say, whose products do you want? They'll often say the US, not Russian, for many reasons, technical, that I don't understand. But the reality is, let's not discount this I'm not saying ideological isn't there, but thinking solely as a Shia crescent or in this ideological way makes us miss that these are incredibly political actors who are trying to succeed in the best way that they can. And if Iran can help them, they'll go for it. But if Iran is not helping them, they'll find someone else.
Yes.
Yeah, about two fingers. One, I would take with a grain of salt popular protests. The biggest popular protest I've ever seen in the Middle East was the Cedar Revolution after Hariri was killed. The whole country rose up. And when was that, 2006,
2005.
2005.
And what happened to that country in the following 2 decades? The Iranian Hezbollah hold tightened against the will of most people. And I think that's important. The second thing is, look, the proxy thing, I spent the 60s debating this, not in the Middle East, but in Southeast Asia, where there were about a dozen Chinese communist proxies. And you're right, they do act independently. Ho Chi Minh, the best of many examples. But they also generally have ideological alignment with and are dependent in various ways on the mothership. Who gives these guys their weapons? Who gives them much of their money? Who monitors them? They will say yes. They will say no at times. In the case of the Houthis, I think sometimes when they are asked to stand down, they don't. In fact, we've seen that with the Hashishabi when they've been particularly angry at us. But those are, you have to live with the ambiguity that they are both. And I accept that they are both, but I want you to accept that they're both too.
Well, I think certainly it's a spectrum.
It's a democracy
and they go back and forth. I do want to make an important point here, which is particularly these big PMF groups. In the last few years, they've become part of the Iraqi government, which means that their primary economic lifeline is not Iran. Iran is not paying them. What's paying them is their access to the Iraqi state. So that challenges some of the loyalties as well, I think.
So now that we're 40-something minutes in, the elephant in the room, perhaps to Victoria and Congressman, aid. You know, the Trump administration is taking an axe to foreign aid. How does that impact, if at all? Even just perception, if not the actual mission. And are you working to try to convince them otherwise?
Well, as the State Department kind of reconstitutes how aid will be distributed, how it will be done strategically, how that will help where we have a purposeful agenda, how that affects Iraq. I think you've seen the administration weigh in on a number of issues that they thought were inflection points in Iraq. The proposed law affecting kind of the umbrella for the Shia militias, I think was important. Moving forward, I think all eyes will be on what happens with the PM in the election. And I think after that, I think the State Department is prepared to help and assist with agenda items on economics and otherwise. But I think they want to wait and see that what happens with the election and what direction they go, particularly with the Shia militias.
So I want to separate out, I think what has, really firmly stopped was the economic development programs, the civil society, democracy building programs. And I think certainly those are lost opportunities that, give potential opportunities to the Chinese and others potentially to fill that gap. Or in some cases, we'll have to force European countries, the UN system, to find other ways to kind of plug the hole left by, the end of that US assistance. I think, what we don't know is how this administration is going to approach, continued military assistance, which has so far not been affected by any of the shutdowns that have occurred with aid. And I think that's still, a big, outstanding, and important question is, to bring it back, what is the future of this military and security partnership going to look like? What are we going to work on together? Will it be still a number of advisors? Are we going to try to retain some kind of operational capability in order to continue supporting ISIS operations? And then I think, one of the big questions still, which no one's really talking about, is what happens in September 2026 when we lose the logistics platform from which we support Syria operations, that platform out of Erbil. And so I think, all of these things will become increasingly important as this administration determines what they want this relationship with Iraq to look like.
Certainly, I'm so glad that you clarified that, but also when you chip away at the economic stability, certainly it could impact any military operations as well, which is partly what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, the kinds of economic support and economic development projects that the U.S. were doing were relatively small scale. I think really what needs to happen right now in the Iraqi economy is this effort towards diversification, but also toward developing energy independence. And so, it's crazy that a country like Iraq, which is so rich in natural resources, still is importing gas from Iran, and which has been a continued point of contention between this administration and the Iraqi government, as well as previous administrations. And so I think there's certainly more that this administration can do to really support and nurture efforts by the Iraqi government to develop the energy sector, to continue furthering energy independence, to push them to take additional reforms that might encourage more U.S. and international investors to enter the economy. But I don't think that, the loss of some of these economic and democracy programs will necessarily shift that balance significantly.
I would also just mention that when I was on the ground in Iraq, what you heard from many Iraqi politicians and government folks is, in a quiet way, of course we need you. We want you there. We need your stability. You cannot leave. They have to have, as they public face, it's a little different on how they message that. But quietly, they know that stability that has been brought about because that needs to stay. And
even from the ones who are sort of perceived publicly as pro-Shia or pro-Iran?
I would say in a quiet way, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think obviously we've talked a little bit about what is the real threat of ISIS in Syria. The unknown of where al-Shara goes, what he does it all fall apart, that can come back quickly, I think scares many Iraqis. And I think that can be used as a mechanism to justify and be able to work with the U.S. moving forward.
So I want to jump in here because I think one important thing that needs to really be mentioned is, when this OIR transition was negotiated, it was under the Biden team, and it was a very different context and a very different administration. And I think many in the Biden team were the Obama team. And so they were part of pulling all of our troops out in 2011, and they were part of having to return U.S. troops in 2014 to try to beat back ISIS. And so I think that memory was very strong, and so there was very much a sense from the Biden team, we need to try to stay as long as we can and as great an amount of forces as we possibly can. That's obviously not the approach from the Trump administration as they look at U.S. military presence across the Middle East. And so, I think what remains to be seen, in that very big difference is, how does this debate play out between these various elements in the Trump administration, between an element which wants to reduce military presence in the Middle East and an element which probably holds maybe more establishment, traditional Republican foreign policy views that might like to stay. And I think, ultimately, the fact that this administration doesn't necessarily want to stay forever in as big a presence does provide some leverage for the Trump administration. And we saw them use it recently. We saw them use it when the Iraqi parliament was considering legislation on the popular mobilization forces. And this administration, really laid down more of a clear marker that, moving that legislation forward and taking a step which really maybe only formalized what is the case, actually in fact right now, could have negative repercussions for the security partnership. And we saw the Iraqi government take steps to pull that out of parliament and push pause. And so I think these dynamics are, certainly very important as we see what happens next.
Ambassador, you were there in 2011. Victoria just mentioned it. Do you have any thoughts to share just on being in the middle of it all?
Yeah.
In terms
First
of
of all,
lessons?
I was sorry to see the troops go because we all felt that something, we couldn't say we were totally prescient, but we feared something like ISIS. We didn't think it would come out of Syria. We were afraid. Less so Iran, because the Iranians had their man more or less in power, and we were kind of living with that. So we're sorry to see it go. And then we had this very broad security operation under the embassy. Now, there's a big debate that I've been involved in. Well, if we had kept the troops on, would half the country have collapsed in 2014? I'm not sure. I think yes, but for a different reason. If the troops were there on the ground, particularly in places like Mosul, and I saw that in Vietnam in '72, when faced with a stark choice between withdrawing troops under fire or fighting, almost any American president is going to fight. But we didn't have troops to have to make that decision about. So the Obama administration did it. One of its own people, Brett McGurk, having your job, Victoria, as the Iraq DAS in December 2013, testified in Congress that ISIS was a growing threat to Iraq, and we needed to do something about it. Well, the administration didn't do anything about it until after Mosul fell, and then it hesitated for 3 more months before it actually put military combat forces on the ground and started bombing. So this is a presidential decision. If you have troops on the ground, as I said, the president is much more likely to use them, but that's not a sufficient cause to have troops on the ground in case somebody somewhere invades you. Where I would disagree is that given the restrictions, some of which are inherent in the 2008 strategic cooperation agreement, that's the wrong word, I think. Framework agreement, which says we can't use forces in Iraq to project power anyplace else, and we are not really doing that with Syria. And the other restrictions that have since been built up, there isn't much difference on the ground between what you can do with a Title 22, that is State Department-led Office of Security Cooperation, Iraq, and a residual force under Title 50. We had 60 aircraft. They were embassy aircraft. They weren't military aircraft, but those 60 aircraft were more than enough to support a few hundred people in Syria. Those people could also be supported out of Jordan. We didn't want to do that before because you had to then overfly territory technically under Russian air defense control. That's gone. They could be supported out of Turkey. We did operations out of Incirlik and various aid and some training, military training operations out of Gaziantep for northeast Syria. So there are other ways. But as I said, look, we just checked the box and say that's a reason to support the troops in Syria. What does that support look like? I've been there a lot. It's a couple of hangars and some office buildings and a couple of helicopters. And I mean, the kind of support they really need in extremists, F-16s, those are based elsewhere.
Right.
So could an OSCI, like it was configured in 2011-12, take over that mission? Sure. Or could that mission be somewhat stood down and done, as I said, out of Turkey, out of Jordan, or even out of Damascus? We're now friends with these guys.
I want to open up to the audience in a moment, but just based on something I'm hearing, I want to throw it out to you all in terms of, what withdrawing actually means. There seems to be different schools of thought within this administration about withdrawing completely or maybe shifting all of our assets to Erbil as an alternative. I see you're already making a face, Ambassador. What are the pros and cons there? At least you have a presence, but I see a lot of folks in the administration kind of also make a face when you talk about just putting assets in Erbil alone because it's not Baghdad. Can you just kind of share your thoughts, any of you who have thoughts on the pros and cons of that? Maybe you, Ambassador? Do you have any thoughts?
Again, what are the missions we want to do? Do we need to do them in Iraq? I could see It would be a little trickier, but I could see the Syria mission supported residually out of Iraq, because I think there are other reasons, including ISIS is a real threat, and we also have stabilization of Syria missions. We're also welcome there at this point.
At this point.
By everybody, including the Turks, with a few asterisks, and certainly Damascus with a few asterisks. So I think that that mission makes sense, and it has to be supported someplace. But I think you could work out various deals. Beyond that, the mission of training, equipping, and supporting the security relationship, including things like intelligence. I mean, the things we put under that umbrella in 2012. Many of them I can't get into, but basically we were able to do everything, you could. Even air defense. Look, the embassy had its own CWIS 20 millimeter, air defense system. And there's just all kinds of things with the connivance. If the Iraqis make a point out of, we do not want a formal military presence, a Title 50, Title 10 presence, rather. I kept saying Title 50 when I meant Title 10. Then you can do most of this stuff as long as it doesn't involve combat with Title 22.
Fascinating. Yeah,
So
please.
maybe I would say, I think, ultimately what you're getting at is this a real change and a real shift in the presence, or is this a rebranding? And of course, we did a rebranding once. We said that it was the end of combat operations in 2021, and we were just training, advising, and assisting. But ultimately, I don't think that was really that significant of a shift. I think what is being contemplated here is potentially a more significant shift in both the nature of the U.S. military presence, how many troops are present, where we're based, and what we're willing to continue working on here. And so, I think a decision to, remove all troops from Ain al-Assad Air Base, a decision to remove all troops from Union 3, and maybe have just a very limited, scaled back, advisory team at the embassy is actually a very significant shift in what the security cooperation had looked like. There's another possibility, because I think the OIR transition agreement was very vague, which is potentially allowing still quite active security cooperation of the kind that Ambassador Jeffrey is mentioning. I think the shift to Erbil, I think that's still significant, that we would still have a significant presence that's able to support the Syria operation. I think the big question for me is really what happens after September 2026. Right. And I think it's not just about whether there's a platform to support Syria operations. I think it's whether there's still a Syria mission, I think is really the bigger question, because we know from Trump 1, and Ambassador Jeffrey knows this better than anyone, the president has had an inclination to get out of Syria since his first term.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I could obviously monopolize this conversation for another 20 minutes, but I do want to give you all an opportunity to ask your questions. So if you want to raise your hand, someone will come around with a mic. Just make sure you introduce yourself. Also, to folks watching virtually, you can send in some questions as well.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ms. Vivian, for the moderation. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. I have a question. You all mentioned that there is a general perception that U.S. bases contribute to stability and safety in the host nation. Though I'd like to ask, given the U.S.'s lack of a definitive stance on the recent Israeli strikes in Qatar, might this prompt some Iraqi leaders and even other Arab leaders to question the reliability of the West as a security partner? Thank you all.
Thank you. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I would say that is a great question. It's one that I'm asking myself right now. And I think we even saw some reports suggesting that the Israelis might have even flown over Iraq as they were hitting Qatar. And I think certainly Iraqis have long believed and hoped that the US military presence would also perhaps insulate them from the possibility of an Israeli attack. And so there was a point about a year ago, as the Israelis were, striking in Lebanon, striking in Syria, where the Iraqi government was deeply, deeply concerned that they could be next. And they were really engaging quite actively their partners, including the United States, to say, what can you do to help prevent an Israeli attack here? And so certainly I know that's something that has been on the mind of Iraqi officials and probably the Iraqi public. And certainly this latest strike in Qatar brings that straight to the fore.
Yeah, could I just comment on that? You're absolutely right, but the whole premise, and we had this in the Trump administration with the Aramco strike, we had it in the Biden administration with the strike in Abu Dhabi. The whole premise is wrong, and we're at fault, America, by saying this is a full security. Rather, it's like a life insurance or a medical insurance, there's a deductible. We don't go to war for anything other than, usually, a major assault, an existential assault on a country. Then if you're a security partner, even if you're not, Ukraine, Korea, Kuwait at the time, we're there for you. That's what you get. Korea is a treaty ally of ours. They have had a ship sunk with 46 people killed by the North Koreans. Their whole, much of their cabinet was blown up in Burma, and they just missed the president in the 1980s. And there was an assault from North Korea on the presidential palace at one point. American reaction, zero. And so the benefit of us is twofold. One is if you really are facing a huge attack, we will be there for you, in part because even if we don't want to be, we can't pull our troops out, so we're in the fight immediately. Two, we're supposed to maintain a regional security environment that precludes these kind of things, and that's where you do have a point. Our security presence in the region and our overall goals were to deter exactly that, and we failed. So in that sense, yeah, they have a right to question us, but the idea that we're going to go to war every time, even when we're hit, look at the sailors captured by the Iranians. We didn't go war over there.
Thanks for the question. The only comment I would make is I think it's too early to tell yet. Things have been changing so rapidly in the Middle East. I mean, every week there's some new existential event that seems to occur. So I don't think we know yet. I do think the brazenness that the Israelis carried this out, I do think sent shockwaves to many of our allies and partners throughout the Middle East. And I think that's put the Trump administration in a tough spot.
It's a bit different because the strikes were not by a U.S. adversary, but it was by Israel itself, one of the closest allies.
No, again, part of the implicit security relationship is we'll manage things in the region such that these things don't happen. And as the congressman said, there's a lot of concern about this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, right here in the front, please. And then...
Thank you. My name is Saran Hamasaid, and I have a question about Iraq's sovereignty over its skies. And I remember reflecting on the events of the past year or so, just the tit for tat that has been occurring between Iran and Israel. What would have looked like if Iraq had capable sovereignty over its and protection over its skies? The Iraqis complain that part of their inability to protect their skies is that the United States is controlling Iraqi skies, and it's preventing Iraq from acquiring systems that would allow it to protect its skies. So my question to the panel is, from your perspective, and probably especially for the congressman and ambassador, but welcome comments from the others, what would it take, from your perspective, for the United States and Iraq to be able to work together to build Iraqi capabilities to protect its skies for its own protection, but also probably a prevention, deconfliction that would not, Iran and Israel may not be doing this tit for tat with each other.
Don't forget Israel and Qatar, and Israel and Yemen just happened this week alone.
Yes,
so.
and speaking of
Maybe
Qatar,
a little bit less.
Yeah, but Qatar is that you have the strongest probably U.S. base in Qatar. There's, from a technical standpoint, there's no way that they would not have seen those planes coming. So even if you have the systems and capability, it has its limitations. But at least Iraq has to start somewhere. So from your perspective, what would that take from
Great
America
question.
to build its capability?
Well, thanks for your question. I think this is very low on the list for the Trump administration. I don't think this is 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of looking at the bilateral relationship and how we strengthen that. I think for all the reasons we talked about, those are the things that come first. Doesn't mean it's not important. Obviously, there are folks within the Iraqi government that are concerned about this. But I think it's a low priority at this point, something to be worked on. But there are other things that have to build on the security apparatus, build on the economic relationship, build on the diplomatic relationship. I think we have a long ways to go. Iraq has made a lot of progress, but we still have a long ways to go before the U.S., I think, entertains that.
Is it almost part of the equation, let Israel do the policing, so to speak, so that we can scale back? Maybe not an intentional part of the calculation, but do you see it, do you hear that it could be a formula for a U.S. withdrawal ultimately? Israel's doing the work for them.
I've not heard that from the Trump administration. I don't think that's accurate.
Okay. I'm just asking the question.
But I just will make the point. I mean, think about in the last year what the Israelis have been able to do. I mean, go back to Tehran, the taking out of Hayaniya in the bomb under his bed. I mean, the perception of how strong Iran was when something like that happened, the taking out from Nasrallah for 30 years led everything, and the next 10 people after him, the walkie-talkies and the pagers, the sophistication and the penetration and what that did. I think that in many ways spooked folks in Iraq to say maybe Iran isn't as strong as they always have been. And again, that has weakened Iran to a point that I think creates an opportunity for the U.S., but much of that was obviously done through the IDF.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for that interesting question. I'm going to take one from online and then I'll come to you. Michael Saya, I hope I said that right, said, what is the potential future of the Iraqi counterterrorism service if the upcoming Iraqi election results in closer Iraqi alignment with Iran? If anyone wants to jump on that. Dr. Mansour, maybe?
I mean, so the counterterrorism service is one of the many bodies under the National Security Council. Its role is primarily was to go after ISIS. It was on the front line of ISIS. It's been deployed in the south on some of certain cases. I don't think that, and it's been an important partner for the U.S. This is the U.S.'s main security partnership for a long time. I don't think it's necessarily going anywhere. I do think that, especially if the PMF law basically formalizes what is already the reality, you do have too many groups under the National Security Council. So I don't think it'll wither away, but I think there are many counter-terrorist groups right now in Iraq. And so I think the bigger question will be who's in charge and who's commanding these groups. And that, I think, we'll have to see moving forward.
Maybe I can just add on to that. I think, as Renata has discussed, obviously CTS, I think, was the group that the United States decided, this is our partner, we're going to train them, we're going to equip them, this is the force we're going to work with. And so I think one question over time is, to what extent some of these militia groups are able to penetrate groups like CTS, and that we're not able to kind of hive the CTS off as a force that, is our core partner that is like really vetted. And so I think that is a question that we will need to continue to look at, particularly following the elections.
Very interesting. Someone right here is being very patient.
Hi, everybody. I'm from the Kurdistan Regional U.S. Representation Office. My question is, we're seeing the recent, as of yesterday, there was a repeal, there's efforts to repeal the 1991 and 2002 authorization of U.S. military force, so the AUMF. My question is, how will that impact operations like counter-ISIS, like CTF, coalition forces that are with the KRG in Iraq and other parts of the region? I'm just curious, what does that show? Am I interpreting this as a new way of the United States posturing itself for a different kind of partnership? Or I just love your interpretation of that.
Anyone want to jump in?
I think it depends on where the administration comes down on this. I mean, I think that will dictate a lot of where this goes, and I've not seen them highlight this as a priority or something they want Congress to take action on.
Someone else had their hand up here yet. Thank you.
Hi, Kate Winston with S&P Global Commodity Insights. The Trump administration has issued a couple rounds of sanctions for entities who have been blending Iranian and Iraqi oil. Do you think that is something we'll be seeing more of, and do you think that would be good or bad for the stability of the region given the changing security situation?
So maybe I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think there have been both public reports and there's been awareness of this problem, for many years, more reports in the public sphere over the past year. And I think, even under the Biden administration, which was not enacting, a max pressure campaign against the Iranians, I think this was of concern. And ultimately, I do think it is important for the U.S. administration to continue to use sanctions as a tool to enforce the sanctions that are in place. I don't think it has dramatic impact, on the, overall source of revenue to the Iranians or to the militias that are part of these smuggling groups. But I do think, in fact, it's very hard for the Iraqi government to really tackle this problem without U.S. sanctions in place, given the political connections of many of the individuals that are affiliated with these smuggling groups.
Yeah.
I don't know where I may have.
And I think it was not imposing sanctions, it was lifting the waiver, wasn't it?
No, there have been 2 rounds of sanctions against specific
I know that.
smuggling rings.
But the general issue of buying stuff from Iran, Iraq has been given annual waivers, hasn't it?
There is that issue as well. So this administration decided to end the electricity waiver that had allowed Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran. There is no general prohibition, however, under U.S. law prohibiting the import of Iranian gas. And so I think in practice, actually the amount of Iranian electricity which was imported into Iraq was relatively low. It's the gas that continues to be the issue in terms of the import and the overall importance of that gas to being able to produce electricity.
Can I say just something? I have a lot to say on sanctions, but I'll keep it to one concern, which is it often looks like whack-a-mole. These companies, these individuals are incredibly adaptive. And so while sanctions may and have become the policy, coercive policy, in Iraq and Iran, of course, as Victoria said, it's not enough. There needs to be more strategy than sanctions. I know that it kind of, in the US or in the UK, Europe, you can say something is done. But the alternative economy is growing. Iran is able to export oil and gas through both formal and informal channels. And it's not just through militias. There are governments, some of which are allies of the US, that are all part of this alternative economy. So the world is changing as well. So sanctions cannot be the only sort of stick, in a way, for policy.
I mean, the question I'm going to end us with, it's probably for you, Dr. Mansour, is, Hossein Ali is asking, do you see a scenario where the Trump administration might accept militia leaders like Qais al-Khazali or Akram al-Qabi to normalize them just as they have in Syria? Or are the dynamics fundamentally different?
Well, I think it was interesting. A few years ago, Muqtada al-Sadr, who was the leader of the Mahdi army, who was responsible for killing so many Americans, became the preferred American candidate in Iraq.
Totally.
So in Syria, you're having a similar dynamic. And this way, if we go back to the sanctions question, it becomes very complicated right now. Yeah, these things are very dynamic. Politics is very dynamic. And there aren't binaries pro this, anti that. So, Qais al-Khazali sees himself as an Iraqi statesman. Not only a resistance, this is the way he sees himself. Do I think the Trump administration will meet? I don't think so.
Okay.
I wouldn't.
better.
I don't think we should get into comparisons with Syria because I think it is a very unique and isolated situation. If you went back 15 years ago and you saw al-Shara or Gilani in a prison in Iraq and said, would you want him to be the leader in Syria? I don't think anybody would have said that would be a good thing.
Definitely didn't have that on my bingo card. You'll all
Yeah.
have to join us for the 7-hour session on Syria another time. Thank you so much to the Atlantic Council and to our wonderful panel. It's been a really great discussion. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
That was terrific.
Thank you so much.
Victoria, thank you.
Thank you so much for doing it.